The strange thing about people who think they're collecting evidence is that they rarely notice who's watching them. By the time Karen Brooks raised her phone for the fifth photograph, the entire street had become unnaturally quiet. It was just after 8 on a clear Saturday morning. Sprinklers clicked across emerald lawns. Freshly cut grass carried the familiar scent of summer through Maple Ridge estates. A delivery truck rolled past without slowing. Somewhere behind the row of houses, a dog barked twice before falling silent. My SUV sat exactly where it had been every weekend for the past 3 years, parallel to the curb in front of my own property, clean, registered, and legally parked beneath the shade of a maple tree. Karen circled it as if she had discovered the scene of a crime. She crouched to photograph the license plate, then the tires, then the distance between the bumper and the curb. She stepped backward to capture the entire vehicle, pausing only long enough to pinch her fingers across the screen and zoom in again. Each shutter sound seemed louder than the last. Click, click, click. She smiled every time she lowered the phone. Not a friendly smile. The kind that appears when someone believes the outcome has already been decided. Across the street, curtains shifted. Mr. Reynolds paused halfway through washing his pickup. A woman walking her golden retriever slowed without realizing it. Nobody interrupted. Everyone in neighborhoods like ours knew Karen. She wasn't officially the president of the HOA anymore, but she never behaved as though she'd surrendered the position. Rules seemed to follow wherever she walked. Conversations stopped when she arrived. Complaints appeared days after ordinary moments no one else considered worth remembering. She noticed me standing on my porch. "There you are," she called, lowering her phone just enough for me to see the satisfaction on her face. "I was wondering when you'd come outside." I rested one hand against the porch railing. "Morning, Karen. You sound awfully relaxed." "I usually am." She laughed softly. "You won't be after the board sees these." She lifted her phone again and captured another photograph. This time she deliberately included both me and the vehicle in the same frame. I glanced toward the SUV. Nothing looked different. The registration sticker was current. The curb was clear. No fire hydrant. No driveway blocked. No sidewalk obstructed. No temporary restrictions posted anywhere along the street. Still, Karen continued photographing as though every angle uncovered another violation invisible to everyone else. "You should probably start reading the parking regulations again," she said. "Some homeowners get comfortable until reality catches up." I almost answered. Instead, I simply nodded. People often mistake silence for surrender. Karen certainly did. She tucked her phone into her handbag with obvious confidence, adjusted the strap on her shoulder, and started walking away. Halfway across the street she stopped, turned back, raised the phone one last time. Another photograph. Another smile. Then she disappeared around the corner without another word. The neighborhood slowly breathed again. Garage doors opened. Children pedaled bicycles down the sidewalk. The golden retriever resumed its morning walk. Everything looked perfectly ordinary. Yet something about the way Karen had taken those pictures stayed with me. It wasn't anger. It wasn't curiosity. It was certainty. She hadn't been searching for evidence. She had already convinced herself she had it. As I looked once more at my parked SUV, one small detail caught my attention, not on the vehicle itself, but in the faint reflection across one of its side windows. I couldn't quite make out what it was from the porch, but something in that reflection didn't belong. And before the morning was over, I knew I was going to find out exactly why Karen had been smiling. The envelope arrived exactly 2 days later. It wasn't certified mail. It wasn't marked urgent. Just a plain white HOA envelope resting neatly inside my mailbox. Almost ordinary enough to ignore. Almost. I carried it into the kitchen without opening it immediately. Morning sunlight spilled across the hardwood floor while the coffee maker hummed softly behind me. Outside, the neighborhood looked exactly as it always did. A teenager jogged past with headphones on. A landscaping crew trimmed hedges 3 houses away. Nothing suggested that the quiet rhythm of Maple Ridge Estates was about to shift. The letter inside was only 3 pages long. Notice of parking violation. The words were printed in bold across the top. According to the HOA, my vehicle had been parked in violation of community regulations and documented through photographic evidence submitted by a resident. The notice requested that I correct the issue immediately to avoid additional fines or further enforcement. I read every sentence twice, then a third time. Curiously, The letter never explained exactly what rule had been broken. Instead, it referenced attached photographs. Karen's photographs. There they were. My SUV. The curb. The front bumper. The rear license plate. Close-ups. Wide shots. Every image looked carefully chosen. She hadn't simply photographed my vehicle. She had built a story. Anyone looking only at those pictures would probably assume something improper had happened. I laid the photographs side by side across the dining table. One detail immediately caught my attention. The shadows. In one image, the shadow from the maple tree stretched toward the passenger's side. In another, it pointed almost directly behind the vehicle. Yet according to the timestamps printed beneath each photograph, they had supposedly been taken only minutes apart. I frowned. Sunlight doesn't move that quickly. I reached for my phone and opened the security camera app connected to the cameras around my property. The recordings were still there. Every minute. Every hour. Nothing had been deleted. I scrolled back to Saturday morning. There was Karen, walking slowly around the SUV, stopping, taking photographs, looking down at her screen, walking away, returning, taking more, then leaving again. Watching the footage felt strangely different from remembering it. In real life, her confidence had seemed intimidating. On camera, something else became obvious. She kept repositioning herself. Sometimes she stood close to the curb, sometimes several feet into the street. Occasionally, she leaned sideways before pressing the shutter, almost as if she were searching for a very specific angle. I paused the video, zoomed in. There it was, the exact moment she crouched beside the driver's door, the same position shown in one of the HOA photographs. Yet the security footage revealed something the photograph did not. She had intentionally framed only part of the scene. I didn't know why. Not yet. A knock interrupted my thoughts. It was my next-door neighbor, Daniel Mercer, carrying a small package that had been delivered to the wrong address. "I figured this belonged to you," he said with a friendly smile. As I thanked him, his eyes drifted toward the papers spread across my dining table. "HOA notice?" I nodded. He sighed quietly. "Karen again?" The way he said it wasn't surprised. It sounded tired, as though he'd heard this story before. "You've dealt with this too?" I asked. Daniel hesitated for a moment before answering. "Let's just say, you're probably not the first person whose pictures look different from what actually happened." After he left, I returned to the table. The photographs no longer looked like proof. They looked edited by perspective, carefully framed, carefully timed. And for the first time since opening the envelope, one question mattered more than every other. If Karen had gone to this much effort to create those images, what exactly was she trying so hard to keep outside the frame? Sometimes the smallest detail isn't hidden at all. It's simply ignored because everyone is looking somewhere else. Daniel's words stayed with me long after he walked back to his house. "You're probably not the first person whose pictures look different from what actually happened." That wasn't gossip. It sounded like experience. I returned to my dining table, where Karen's photographs remained spread across the polished wood like pieces of a puzzle assembled by someone determined to create only one conclusion. At first glance, every image looked convincing. The framing was clean. The vehicle appeared isolated. The curb seemed unusually narrow. Even I had to admit they were effective. But photographs never tell the entire story. They tell the story chosen by the person holding the camera. I carried my laptop into the room and opened the security footage on the larger screen. Then I placed Karen's printed photographs beside it, frame by frame, minute by minute. The comparison began. The first photograph matched exactly. So did the second. The third. Almost. I paused both images. Something felt wrong. Not obvious. Just uncomfortable. I leaned closer. The reflection in the driver's side window caught my attention again. Last Saturday, I had barely noticed it. Now it demanded my attention. The glass reflected the opposite side of the street with surprising clarity. Mailboxes. A section of sidewalk. Part of a parked landscaping trailer. I enlarged the security footage, then enlarged the photograph. The trailer appeared in both. But something was missing. According to the reflection, another vehicle should have been visible just beyond it. Yet Karen's photograph showed nothing. I frowned. That didn't make sense. Unless she hadn't simply chosen a different angle. She had chosen a different moment. I checked the timestamp embedded in my camera footage. 8 hours, 17 minutes, and 43 seconds. Karen's printed photograph claimed 8:18. Only 17 seconds apart. Impossible. The landscaping trailer had already started pulling away by then. The reflection proved it. I replayed the footage. The trailer moved. A pickup truck followed behind it. Children on bicycles crossed the intersection. Everything flowed naturally. Life leaves traces. And those traces always create a timeline. I opened another folder. The security cameras automatically stored precise timestamps synchronized through the internet every night. They couldn't drift by minutes. They couldn't be adjusted accidentally. Every second was recorded. I looked back at Karen's photographs. For the first time, I stopped seeing them as evidence. I started seeing them as selected moments. Carefully selected. The realization settled over me quietly. She wasn't documenting reality. She was documenting a version of reality. My phone buzzed. An email notification. The HOA board had scheduled a compliance review meeting for the following Thursday evening. Attendance requested. Supporting documentation encouraged. I smiled for the first time since. Opening the violation notice. Supporting documentation. That worked both ways. Instead of feeling anxious, I opened a fresh notebook and wrote one sentence across the top of the first page. Timeline. Nothing else. If Karen wanted this discussion to revolve around photographs, then photographs it would be. Only this time, they wouldn't stand alone. Every image would have a timestamp. Every timestamp would have a corresponding video frame. Every video frame would have context. Truth rarely arrives all at once. It arrives piece by piece. Outside, I noticed Karen walking her usual route through the neighborhood. She greeted two homeowners with complete confidence. She laughed. She waved. Her phone rested comfortably in one hand. For someone who believed the case was already finished, she looked remarkably relaxed. She never glanced toward my house. She didn't know I had spent the afternoon examining every second she thought no one else would ever watch. She didn't know the reflection in my window had quietly introduced a witness she never intended to include. And she certainly didn't know that the more carefully I reconstructed Saturday morning, the less her photographs resembled evidence, and the more they resembled a carefully edited story waiting for its missing chapters. Truth doesn't become stronger because you raise your voice. It becomes stronger because every piece fits where it belongs. Thursday's meeting was still days away. That gave me something Karen didn't realize I possessed. Time. Not to invent a defense. To reconstruct reality. By Tuesday morning, my dining room no longer looked like a place for breakfast. It looked like an investigation. Printed security camera stills covered one end of the table. The HOA parking regulations lay open beside them, every relevant paragraph highlighted in yellow. A legal pad held a handwritten timeline, each event listed down to the second. Laptop. Tablet. External hard drive. Even the weather report from Saturday morning sat neatly clipped to one corner. If someone walked into the room without context, they might have mistaken it for a detective's workspace. I wasn't trying to prove Karen wrong. I was trying to prove exactly what had happened. There is a difference. I downloaded the original security footage directly from the recorder instead of relying on the mobile app. The exported files contained embedded timestamps accurate to the second. Next, I photographed the same section of curb from multiple angles. Standing where Karen had stood. Standing where my cameras were mounted. Standing where a passing driver would have seen the street. Perspective changed everything. From one position, my SUV appeared unusually close to the curb. From another, it looked perfectly ordinary. Neither image lied. Neither image told the whole truth. I added both to the folder. Then I measured the actual distance between the tires and the curb with a tape measure. Nothing extraordinary. Nothing unusual. Exactly what I had expected. As the afternoon wore on, another thought returned. Daniel. I walked next door carrying 2 cups of coffee. He opened the door before I reached the porch. Working on your HOA case? He asked with a knowing smile. I laughed quietly. Is it that obvious? He glanced toward the folders under my arm. You've reached the evidence stage. We sat on his back patio beneath an old oak tree. For several minutes, we talked about everything except the HOA. Finally, he leaned back. You know what Karen counts on? I shook my head. Most people getting angry. He looked toward the street. When people get emotional, they stop collecting facts. That sentence stayed with me. Daniel disappeared inside for a moment before returning with a thin folder. I wasn't sure I'd ever need this again. Inside were copies of emails from 2 years earlier. Nothing dramatic. Nothing explosive. Just polite conversations with the HOA regarding another complaint Karen had submitted. One page caught my attention. A board member had written that photographs submitted without sufficient context should always be verified before enforcement decisions were made. I read the sentence twice, then a third time. Apparently, the board already knew photographs could be misleading. Somewhere along the way, that lesson had been forgotten. Daniel smiled faintly. I figured it might help. It already has. Back home, I placed his documents beside my own. Suddenly, the investigation felt larger than my parking notice. This wasn't simply about one SUV. It was about how easily incomplete evidence could become accepted as complete truth. As evening settled over Maple Ridge Estates, I assembled everything into a single binder. Section 1. Timeline. Section 2. Security footage. Section 3. Parking regulations. Section 4. Photographic comparisons. Section 5. Supporting correspondence. I closed the binder. Not because I believed I had finished. Because for the first time since Karen raised her phone on Saturday morning, I realized I no longer needed to chase the truth. The truth was already organized, waiting. And if Karen intended to walk into Thursday's meeting carrying nothing but carefully framed photographs, she was about to discover what happens when a story built on selected moments collides with one built on complete evidence. People who believe they're winning usually make one mistake. They stop being careful. Thursday morning arrived warm and cloudless. The neighborhood looked almost peaceful enough to make the past few days feel imaginary. Children waited for the school bus at the entrance to Maple Ridge Estates. A lawn service trailer rattled past my driveway. Somewhere nearby, someone was grilling breakfast sausage, and the scent drifted lazily through the cool air. Life had moved on. Karen hadn't. She appeared halfway down the sidewalk, carrying the same leather handbag I'd seen on Saturday. The one that always seemed to hold her phone within easy reach. She wasn't alone. 2 homeowners stood beside her, listening as she spoke with animated confidence. Even from my porch, I could recognize the expression on her face. She wasn't discussing possibilities. She was announcing conclusions. As I walked toward my mailbox, their conversation quieted for only a moment. Then Karen smiled. "Good morning, Nathan." "Morning. I hope you've had enough time to prepare." Her voice was almost cheerful. "The board appreciates homeowners who admit mistakes before meetings." "I'll remember that." She tilted her head. "I imagine they'll have quite a few questions." "I'm counting on it." For just a fraction of a second, something flickered across her face. Not uncertainty, more like surprise. As though my calm response didn't fit the version of events she had already written in her mind. Before either of us spoke again, she reached into her handbag. Out came the phone. Again. Without hesitation, she pointed it toward my SUV. Click. Another photograph. Then another. She slowly stepped sideways. Click. She crouched near the curb. Click. I watched without moving. She wasn't documenting anything new. The vehicle hadn't changed position since Saturday. Nothing about the street had changed. Only the number of photographs had. One of the neighbors chuckled. Still gathering evidence. Karen smiled proudly. You can never have too much documentation. I almost smiled myself. Because I knew something she didn't. Every additional photograph made her story more complicated. Not stronger. She walked farther into the street before taking several wide-angle shots. Then she circled behind the SUV. Another series. Different angles. Different distances. Different lighting. Too many angles. Too many versions of the same moment. The investigator in me had started noticing patterns. People trying to preserve evidence usually avoid changing perspectives. People trying to create impressions rarely do. Karen finished her final photograph and slipped the phone back into her bag. "I'll see everyone tonight." She said it loudly enough for nearby neighbors to hear. Then she walked away with complete confidence. After she disappeared around the corner, I remained standing beside the curb. My eyes drifted across the asphalt, the mailbox, the tree, the storm drain, the sidewalk. Then I noticed something I hadn't measured before. The position where Karen had crouched. It placed her camera nearly 2 feet inside the street rather than directly beside the curb. That explained why the vehicle appeared closer to the curb in several photographs. Perspective. Nothing more. Nothing less. Back inside, I added one final page to the binder. Supplemental observations. I sketched a simple diagram of the street. My driveway. The curb. Karen's camera. Positions. The approximate locations where each photograph had been taken. No accusations. No opinions. Only geometry. As I closed the binder, my phone vibrated. An automated reminder from the HOA. Compliance review meeting, 7 p.m. Please arrive 10 minutes early. I looked once more at the neatly organized sections inside the binder. Every timestamp, every regulation, every photograph, every measurement. Karen believed she was arriving with more evidence than ever before. She had no idea that every new picture she'd taken that morning wasn't reinforcing her case. It was quietly creating the inconsistencies that would allow the entire story to unravel, one image at a time. The room had already decided who was guilty before anyone said a single word. The Maple Ridge HOA clubhouse looked colder at night. Bright fluorescent lights washed the color from the beige walls. Folding chairs had been arranged in neat rows facing a long conference table where 5 board members quietly organized stacks of documents. The air smelled faintly of coffee, printer paper, and furniture polish. I arrived 12 minutes early. So did Karen. She stood near the entrance speaking comfortably with several homeowners, laughing as though tonight were nothing more than another neighborhood gathering. The leather folder tucked beneath her arm looked thicker than before. More photographs. More confidence. When she noticed me walking in, she smiled politely. I see you brought paperwork too. I did. I hope it helps. So do I. She seemed almost disappointed that I refused to sound nervous. One by one, the remaining homeowners entered the room. Daniel nodded as he found a seat near the back. Mr. Reynolds sat beside him. Several people whispered quietly while glancing in my direction. Nobody needed to ask why we were there. At precisely 7 o'clock, Board President Linda Harper adjusted her glasses and called the meeting to order. Routine business came first. Landscaping contracts, pool maintenance, budget approvals. My name didn't appear until nearly 40 minutes later. Next item, Linda announced, looking down at the agenda. Parking compliance review regarding Lot 37. Every conversation stopped. Karen straightened in her chair. A board member opened a large envelope. The familiar photographs slid onto the conference table. I submitted these images last Saturday. Karen began before anyone asked her to speak. They clearly demonstrate repeated violations of our parking regulations. Her voice carried easily across the room. Calm, prepared, practiced. One by one, the photographs were passed down the table. Board members examined them carefully. Several nodded. One frowned. Another measured something with a small ruler printed along the edge of a document folder. From where I sat, I recognized every image, even the new ones she'd taken that morning. Karen continued. The vehicle has remained improperly positioned despite previous opportunities to correct the situation. She spoke with remarkable certainty, as though there were no other interpretation. Linda finally looked toward me. Mr. Collins, would you like to respond? Every eye in the room shifted. This was the moment many people expected an argument, an emotional defense, frustration, excuses. Instead, I stood, picked up my binder, and walked calmly to the front table. I'd like to respond, I said quietly. But before I do, I looked at the photographs spread across the table. I'd like to thank Mrs. Brooks. Karen blinked. The room became unusually still. One board member lowered his pen. Another leaned forward. Karen's confident smile faded just enough to notice. Linda looked puzzled. For what? She asked. For documenting the entire event. Karen frowned. I documented the violation. I met her eyes for the first time that evening. I believe you documented something much more important than that. Silence. No one interrupted. No one seemed certain where the conversation was heading anymore. I carefully opened my binder. The metal rings clicked softly inside the otherwise silent room. Section tabs appeared one after another. Timeline, regulations, measurements, security footage, photographic analysis. I didn't hand anyone a single page yet. There was no rush. Truth rarely benefits from haste. Karen shifted in her chair, almost imperceptibly. It was the first sign of discomfort I'd seen from her all week. Because for the first time since Saturday morning, the meeting was no longer revolving around her photographs. It was revolving around everything those photographs failed to show. And although no one in the room realized it yet, the side they thought they were sitting on had already begun to change. Evidence doesn't collapse with a dramatic confession. It collapses the moment two versions of reality can no longer exist at the same time. The room remained silent as I opened the first section of my binder. No one interrupted. Even Karen, who had spoken with unwavering confidence only moments earlier, now watched without saying a word. I removed a single photograph from a protective sleeve. It looked almost identical to one of hers. Same SUV, same curb, same morning. Only one difference. Mine showed the entire scene, not just the portion inside a carefully chosen frame. I placed it beside Karen's photograph. These were taken less than 20 seconds apart, I said. Several board members leaned forward. The vehicle hasn't moved. Linda Harper adjusted her glasses. It certainly appears that way. It does. I nodded. Because it is. I turned to the next page. A printed aerial diagram of the street. Colored circles marked every position where Karen had stood while taking photographs. Blue arrows indicated the direction of each camera angle. Then I laid a measuring tape across the diagram. The apparent distance between my vehicle and the curb changes depending on where the camera is positioned. No one spoke. I continued calmly. If I stand here, I pointed toward the first marker. The perspective compresses the space. My finger moved to another position. If I stand here, then another. The exact same vehicle appears significantly farther away. One board member quietly nodded. Perspective. Simple. Understandable. Karen finally leaned forward. That doesn't change where your vehicle was parked. No, it doesn't. I looked directly at her. It changes whether your photographs accurately represented it. She opened her mouth to respond. Nothing came out. I reached into the binder once more. This time, I removed a large printed still captured from my security camera. Unlike the close-up photographs, this image showed the entire street. The sidewalk, the landscaping trailer, the neighboring driveway, Karen herself, standing beside my SUV with her phone raised. I synchronized my security cameras with the timestamps printed on your photographs. I slid another page across the table, a second-by-second timeline. Every image matched to a corresponding frame from the video. Linda studied the pages carefully. So your cameras recorded the same period? They recorded the entire morning. Another board member frowned. I noticed these timestamps don't align. They don't. I let the silence settle before speaking again, because the photographs tell only selected moments. Then I placed one final page onto the table, the enlarged reflection from my driver's side window. At first glance, it looked unremarkable. Glass, sky, trees. But after a few seconds, everyone noticed it. The landscaping trailer reflected in the window occupied a different position than it should have if Karen's printed timestamp were accurate. Linda looked back and forth between the reflection and the timeline, then at Karen, then back again. The trailer couldn't have been in both places. It couldn't. The realization spread across the table without anyone saying it aloud. Karen's photographs were not false because they had been edited. They were misleading because they had been presented without the context that gave them meaning. Perspective had become proof. Silence settled over the room once more. Not uncomfortable. Thoughtful. Karen finally found her voice. Those reflections don't prove anything. I gently shook my head. They don't stand alone. I reached toward the laptop resting beside my binder. They're simply the reason I knew where to look. I connected a small flash drive. The projector mounted above the conference table flickered to life. A frozen frame appeared on the screen. Karen, standing beside my SUV. Phone raised. Preparing to take another photograph. I looked around the room before resting my hand on the keyboard. Photographs capture a fraction of a second. My finger hovered over the space bar. But video captures everything that happens before and after that fraction. No one looked at me anymore. Every eye in the clubhouse was fixed on the screen. And Karen, for the first time that evening, slowly realized that the next few seconds would not be controlled by the photographs she had chosen. They would be controlled by the moments she had never expected anyone else to see. The difference between a photograph and a recording is simple. One captures what someone wants you to see. The other remembers what actually happened. My thumb pressed the space bar. The frozen image dissolved into motion. For a few seconds, nothing extraordinary happened. The video showed an ordinary Saturday morning. Birds crossed the frame. A cyclist rolled past the entrance to the neighborhood. Leaves stirred beneath a light breeze. Then Karen entered the picture. She walked confidently toward my driveway with her phone already in her hand. The room watched in complete silence. She stopped beside my SUV, raised the phone, took a photograph, then another. Nothing surprising. Until she moved. Instead of remaining in one position, she stepped farther into the street. Another photograph. Then she crouched lower. Another. She leaned toward the curb. Another. Each movement subtly changed the relationship between the vehicle and the pavement. The perspective shifted. The SUV appeared closer, then farther, then closer again, without moving an inch. Nobody in the room said a word. The only sound came from the projector's quiet fan. The video continued. Karen walked around the front of the vehicle. She paused, looked carefully at the phone screen, deleted something, took another photograph, deleted another, then photographed the same angle again. A board member slowly lowered his pen. Linda Harper glanced briefly toward Karen before returning her attention to the screen. The recording wasn't accusing anyone. It simply refused to leave anything out. I paused the video. This frame corresponds to photograph 4. I placed the printed image beside the projected screen. They match. I advanced the recording 5 seconds. This is when photograph 5 was taken. Another match. Then another. Then another. Every printed image found its place inside the timeline. No mystery. No assumptions. Only sequence. Karen finally spoke. I was trying to get a clear picture. You did. I answered quietly. Several of them. She folded her arms. There's nothing wrong with taking multiple photographs. I agree. The room turned toward me again. There isn't. I allowed the words to settle. The problem begins when only certain photographs are presented as though they represent the entire event. No one disagreed, because the screen behind me had already answered the question. The recording showed every discarded angle, every adjustment, every step into the street, every moment leading to the images eventually submitted to the board. Linda looked toward the remaining members. I think we've all seen enough. One of the directors slowly shook his head. The photographs aren't false. No, another replied. They're incomplete. That single word changed everything. Incomplete. Not fabricated. Not manipulated. Incomplete. And incomplete evidence was no longer enough to support the certainty with which the violation had been presented. Karen's confidence seemed to disappear almost visibly. She looked at the photographs spread across the conference table as though seeing them for the first time. Only now they no longer looked persuasive. They looked selective. Linda closed the folder containing the complaint. I have one question. She looked directly at Karen. When you submitted these photographs, Karen swallowed. Did you inform the board that multiple additional images and surrounding context existed? The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it felt much longer. Karen slowly lowered her eyes. I didn't think it was necessary. No one answered immediately, because everyone understood what those words meant. She hadn't lied. She had decided which parts of the truth deserved to be seen. Linda folded her hands on the table. I believe the board has enough information to reach a decision. No one asked to review the photographs again. No one questioned the timeline. No one requested another measurement. The evidence had already done everything it needed to do, not by proving someone wrong, but by allowing the complete story to replace the carefully edited one. And in that quiet clubhouse, beneath the steady glow of fluorescent lights, every camera angle Karen had chosen so carefully had become the very reason her case could no longer stand. Winning rarely sounds the way people imagine. Sometimes it sounds like a chair sliding backward, a folder quietly closing, and a room that suddenly has nothing left to argue about. Linda Harper looked around the conference table before speaking. Based on the evidence presented tonight, she paused only long enough to ensure every board member was ready. The board finds insufficient evidence to support the alleged parking violation. No applause followed. No dramatic reactions. Only several quiet nods around the table. The complaint was dismissed. Just like that. A single motion of Linda's pen crossed through the violation notice that had occupied my attention all week. Then she looked toward the rest of the board. I believe this situation also raises a larger concern. Every homeowner listened. When complaints rely primarily on photographs, complete supporting context should accompany those submissions whenever possible. Another board member agreed. I think we should update our review procedures. So do I. Mr. Reynolds quietly smiled from the second row. Daniel folded his arms with the satisfied expression of someone watching common sense finally catch up with reality. Karen remained perfectly still. The confidence that had carried her into the clubhouse never returned. Her leather folder stayed closed. She no longer reached for the photographs. There was nothing left they could accomplish. As homeowners began gathering their belongings, Linda stopped me before I left. Mr. Collins. I turned. I appreciate the professionalism you showed tonight. Thank you. You made your case without making this personal. I looked briefly toward the conference table where the photographs still rested. It never needed to be personal. She smiled. I wish more meetings ended that way. Outside, the evening air felt noticeably cooler. The neighborhood was quiet again. Streetlights reflected softly across parked vehicles lining the curb. Daniel caught up with me before I reached my driveway. You know, he said with a grin. I thought someone was going to start shouting in there. I considered saving everyone the entertainment. He laughed. Good thing you didn't. We stood for a moment looking down the empty street. Everything appeared exactly as it had 6 days earlier. Same sidewalks. Same mailboxes. Same houses. The only thing that had changed was what people believed they had seen. Over the following weeks, subtle differences began appearing throughout Maple Ridge Estates. The HOA adopted new review guidelines requiring supporting context before issuing certain violations. Photographs alone were no longer treated as automatic proof. Security footage, measurements, and additional verification became standard practice. No announcement celebrated the change. It simply appeared in the monthly newsletter. Quietly. Permanently. As for Karen, she remained in the neighborhood. People still waved politely when passing her on morning walks. No one humiliated her. No one mocked her. But something else disappeared. Whenever she lifted her phone towards someone else's property, nearby conversations seemed to pause. Neighbors noticed. Not because they feared another complaint. Because they now understood that a single image could never tell an entire story. Several mornings later, I parked my SUV in exactly the same spot. I switched off the engine and glanced toward the driver's side window. For a second, I saw my own reflection staring back. Behind it stretched the street, the trees, the mailbox, the neighborhood that had finally learned the difference between appearance and evidence. I smiled. Not because I had defeated Karen. Because I hadn't needed to. Facts had done that work long before anyone voted. As I walked toward my front door, I realized the reflection that had first caught my attention days earlier had never really been the hero of the story. It had simply reminded me of something easy to forget. Truth is rarely hidden. Most of the time, it's already there, waiting for someone patient enough to look beyond the frame.